Tabitha looked across at Dumbledore, who was wearing the same expression of serenity that he had been wearing when she first met him, almost 16 years ago, when he had welcomed her to the school and declared somewhat unusual start as a gift. Some gift, Tabitha had often thought bitterly since that day, before gasping inwardly as Dumbledore's gaze met hers very briefly and she immediately glanced away. "We have been closed since February, madam," replied Dumbledore, gesturing in Umbridge's direction before encompassing the vast panorama of the castle. "With the exception of the kind communal of information regarding Miss Penright's arrival in the capacity of Mole Studies teacher, nothing whatever to do with any discrepancies has been mentioned before your enthusiastic audit of my school last night." He glanced between Snape and McGonagall, who were both staring accusingly at Umbridge. They had paid particular attention to both of their classrooms, Tabitha recalled. "That's as maybe," nodded Umbridge dismissively, folding her arms, taking a few steps towards the still silent Tabitha and handing her the refurled list. "You have the month until I return. In addition to Miss Penright's other work." Here she raised her left eyebrow in Snape's direction, and Tabitha's heart sank as the mysterious-shaped hole in her working premise was replaced by the stone-faced livid-looking wizard, and she continued to wonder vaguely what exactly her role there would entail as Umbridge continued. "Who will return tomorrow once she is ready equipped for her taxing responsibility." Ignoring the eyes upon her, Tabitha felt her heart rise back to its place in her chest as the news of her reprieve enveloped her. A day on hold was the enveloping abyss that she had imagined her future hitherto to be. One day where she could make good her work at the Ministry, speak to Vincento, and make the best of it before she returned. Her mind drifted to her office, the dark and cavern-like room where she spent the best hours of her day. Vincento had opened the pile of letters on his desk, she noticed, and the filing cabinets that contained accounts of the events during the battle at Hogwarts had gone. All that time she had spent on piecing together information wasted. "When you have quite finished daydreaming, Penright," Tabitha jumped as Umbridge's voice penetrated her consciousness and she turned in the direction of her boss's voice. As she did so, she realized that they were quite alone in the small staff room, the sunlight from the large Gothic-like windows their only other companion. "The sooner we return to the Ministry, the sooner you'll be back here. Maybe even those wretched children you'll have to teach will be of some use to us." A smile played on Dolores Umbridge's toad-like features as she glanced unapologetically at the oak-paneled walls, before slapping a large hand on Tabitha's shoulder, making her jump. "Though I'm sure you won't need it," she continued silkily. "Penright, I am confident that under your particular brand of expertise Hogwarts will soon yield its secrets." 88,888,888. An autumn wedding. Standing outside a church set on a hillside, watching the vernal sunlight glinting off the mid-morning dew that still clung determinedly to the shaded copper leaves, Cecilia smiled. People were gathering around the Norman Arch entrance, greeting other people as cars drew up, dropping them off, hugging them and shaking hands. Cecilia continued to watch from her vantage point as her mother and father, miraculously resurrected from his heart attack 15 years ago, welcomed the guests who mingled and milled on the gravel before the church. She made her way forward, smiling ever happier as she marveled at how her sister's lithe frame managed to beautify the plain cream dress that she was wearing, much as she had done the last time she had played the role of chief bridesmaid for Cecilia. And before she could drink in any more of the scenery, Libby hugged her, her bump pressing on Cecilia's stomach as her best friend wished her luck before Freya bounded over too, determined not to miss out on hugs as she cast aside her basket of flowers, much to her mother's dismay. And then they were heading in, her arm entwined in her father's as they trod carefully on the red velvet carpet. The Amy and Libby heading towards the altar to become Mrs. Lupin. She swept her head right, and then left, the pew's occupants contrasting outrageously with one another. Same sun whose light had intruded early that morning into a conversation over 100 miles away had arched the sky, making a glorious Monday, was now creeping its evocative rays through a small glass window, illuminating a burgundy liquid that was cooling off on a cork ring. Cecilia blinked as reality stole in from the peripherals of her vision, and she stared consciously at its iridescence as she pondered the night before. Remus had seemed much calmer and more himself after his conversation with Sirius, and he had kissed her good night in his usual manner, though she had been awoken by his tossing and turning in the early hours of the morning before finally he had got up and gone downstairs. Cecilia hadn't followed him. This formal accusation was affecting him greatly, she thought, and, as the kitchen door had creaked loudly open, it was clear, she reasoned, that he needed his own space to come to terms with it himself before she could be there for him. Taking up the flask on the bench before her, she filled a corner of the room with steam which poured from the vessel as Cecilia ran it under the cold water of the tap in the corner of the utility room. Almost immediately as it had been released, the steam condensed onto the windows, fogging them. If she was leaving him to himself, she reasoned, then why was there an anxious knot in her stomach? It had been worse that morning. She had arisen when she heard a tapping on a window downstairs, so she went to shoo away the owl that was making it, and it was only when it had flapped nonchalantly away with its burden of rolled paper that she realized with rising panic and indignant annoyance that Remus had left without saying goodbye. Her annoyance then had been replaced by fear for his safety, and it had crossed Cecilia's mind that she should flew or write to Dumbledore. Fear gave way to resignation. He hadn't wanted her to know where he was, or what he was doing, and Cecilia had sighed inwardly to herself before proceeding with potion blend number 30, carefully and deliberately putting aside her work on a possible werewolf cure. The familiar procedural nature of her analysis had been a salve to Cecilia's emotional wounds, and, as she busied herself with the potion, chopping herbs, grinding seeds, assembling for a distillation, and her mind had daydreamed too. Well, her wedding to Remus wouldn't be anything close to what she had fantasized about that afternoon. For a start, her father and best friend would definitely not be available, nor her mother, sister and little Freya. And could they marry in a church at all? She and Tim had, and Cecilia remembered the time-consuming procedure of paperwork to show that he attended church. How would a vicar react when he met Remus Lupin? And at once the crushing sadness and deep guilt that Cecilia still felt about her friend's death and her part in Libby's downfall weighed on her chest like an anvil. She, Cecilia, was alive, here, working in this little room on something full of wonder and of a fantastic nature. She was living with a man she loved and working for a worthwhile cause while Freya would grow to maturity without her parents. Nothing in the world would put that right. It was something she could not share, even with Remus. It was not fair to burden him with the knowledge that she bore that their world, and inadvertently, the Mole world, had suffered with more grief than she could ever have imagined. Burying her sorrow, Cecilia shook her head, focusing back on the blend of number 30 which was now cool, and she returned it to the still, warming the bottom of the flask gently. It shouldn't be long now, Cecilia thought, watching as random gas bubbles rose up, bursting intermittently on the surface as the crystallized mark just above the level of the liquid became part of the potion again, and Cecilia began to daydream again. This time about happier times with her best friend, and she didn't hear the latch on the back door click open. Remus Lupin crossed the kitchen floor of the cottage, whose character had not changed since the first moment he had crossed it almost 30 years ago. Then, he had been holding his father's hand, watching as Dad's black robes bounced off the surface of the large tiles. He remembered staring at those same orange and brown flowery tiles from his seat on the kitchen table onto which his father had deposited him before John Lupin had leaned on the door to the living room where his mother, Remus's grandmother, would be. Now, the tiles bore the same pattern and, in essence, they were the same as they were then. 30 years had brought with them age, however, and small patches were beginning to wear away. But they were still the same tiles. Just as I am still the same as I was then, thought Remus, as his eyes traced the contours of the chrysanthemum picked out in orange as he used to. Just the same. Sullied. Tainted. Sub-wizard. He reached the door of the utility room, once a larder where his grandmother stored everything and where often Remus would sit, just to be on his own. Now, the wooden worktops were being put to a different use by a different woman in his life. Cecilia Jane Frobisher's hair shone like a new canute in the evening sunlight as she busied herself with the work she was doing, and Remus felt himself watching her in fascination as he used to do when she first came into their lives. Remus's eye drifted from her hair across to the distillation that was simmering quietly over an old gas burner before drifting back to watch her as Cecilia manipulated a whole handful of anonymous herbs which she proceeded to pound underneath a pestle. It was only when his eyes came to rest on her ample derriere that he realized that he needn't just wish those thoughts that used to be his staple fare. She had promised to be his forever, and that was something special. He wasn't the only wizard who had held that body, his treacherous thoughts reminded him. Not that he begrudged his friend, Sirius was at heart a womanizer. Remus could no more ask Molly Weasley to not fret over her children or Tunks to walk through a china shop without incurring a damages bill than expect him to act unserious-like. Not that it worried Remus now. His best friend was still his best friend now he had Cecilia in his life. Her work had brought her to him, and despite the true horrors that many of the people around him had suffered since the rise of Voldemort, she was most certainly not one of them. Only. It was not just her work. Under that sweaty brow, brought on by her determination to pulverize the herbs under her hand, inside that mind which worked continually in its own marvelous way, some of her thoughts were given over to him. Shaking his head, as if to dislodge an errand bee of an adverse contemplation from his mind, Remus turned instead to examine his own decision about the happenings of the day. Just as he hadn't wanted to share with her what he had endured the day before, he desired the events of the day to remain undiscussed and unshared. But Cecilia seemed to have an uncanny ability to know when there was something wrong, and everything had come tumbling out the day before when he had seen her with Snape. His hackles had risen and he had become defensive. A creak of the floorboards under Remus's foot made Cecilia turn, and as soon as she saw him he smiled at her. A wave of happiness passed through him. "How long have you been there?" she asked, crossing over the floor and planting a kiss on his cheek before locking her hands behind his back. "Where were you this morning? I was worried." "Order stuff," he said, hoping he sounded casual enough for his apprehension to go unnoticed. "I'm sorry it took so long, love." He returned her kiss, tasting a sweet tang on her lips as her warm body pressed against him. "And you?" "The potion," she replied, looking back at the simmering brew. "It'll be good to get this one done. I really think this is the turning point, you know." Unlocking her hands, she moved back over to the potion blend and reduced the gas flame so the bubbles of the liquid began to reduce. "No," he replied, looking with interest at the potion. "I wasn't bad myself at school." He flicked over a couple of pages in her notebook, nodding in recognition at some of the ingredients. "Honeysuckle. Ghana roots," he murmured, glancing at the potion. "How different this is to the potion I remember making with such ingredients. I suppose it's something scientific." He glanced across to Cecilia hopefully. There was a pause. "Would you like me to explain what I've got here?" she asked, slightly too quickly, and she registered the pained expression on his face. "What I mean to say is that it's actually quite straightforward, really." "It's just," began Remus. But Cecilia interrupted him, shaking her head dismissively. "What?" he asked, confused. "It's nothing, really," she replied, turning away from Remus. "I'm doing what I can do, it's not complicated," she added, folding her arms. "Can you tell me about this one, number 30? The one that's so special?" asked Remus, looking again at the potion. Cecilia shrugged, dismissively. "But you could tell Severus Snape, that's who you could tell." Remus's accusation was barely hostile, but its pitiful character struck at Cecilia and she turned in shock. "Why is your work never good enough for me to know?" he added reproachfully. Why is yours? She retorted, refolding her arms defensively. I don't know what you do when you go out every morning. Why do you need to know everything about this? Silence reigned momentarily before she added, because he turned up, and asked me. Don't you want me to do the work? Remus looked away, holding his head in the way she remembered him doing every so often. When he gave her mysterious mythology, when she caught him up early on the day that he and Tunks had accompanied her back to work to analyze the hair samples all those months ago. The stance he had taken when he had been criticized by Sirius for defending her at the order ball. Cecilia unfolded her arms and took a few steps towards him. I want none of us to do it, he replied, walking towards her. They met halfway and caught her in his arms. I want it to be just us. He kissed her on the head, and Cecilia pulled her away, smiling at his confused frown. Come on, we can do it quicker together, she said, leaning over and handing him a bundle of time and a pestle and mortar. But how? You know the standard wizard spells. You know about potions? Remus nodded dumbly. Well, show me, then. And for the next hour, Mr. and soon-to-be Mrs. Lupin worked on the next potion, the one that might be the one that could hasten the end to the reign of terror that Voldemort had evoked. Remus carried out some of the more simple spells, recording the results faithfully and accurately while Cecilia set up a second still for the next batch of ingredients where she tested a variation in the ratio of ragwort and wintergreen, discussing with Remus the fundamentals of science in terms of cause and effect and hoping that her enthusiasm for the potion did not inadvertently extend to her excitement at her discovery of a possible cure. Once they had come to a natural end, Remus took Cecilia in his arms again, inhaling the fragrances that had infused between the strands of her hair. He was happy to see her happy, though more so that she had not mentioned Snape again, and his relaxation had caused Cecilia to relax too. After a time, still standing in the utility room, Cecilia pulled away to look at him. Can we marry in the mole world? Her question hung between them for a few moments before Remus wriggled his moustache momentarily, smiling wanly at her. You're not happy, he concluded, as if the truth had come out at last. I am very happy, and I would be happier to call myself Mrs. Remus John Lupin. But that's not likely to happen in the wizard world in the near future, is it? So if you're happy, continued Remus, smiling at her as if talking to a child, what does a piece of paper matter? It matters, replied Cecilia in equally deliberate tones, while this war is going on. It matters. She trailed off, wondering how she could convey her meaning when words did not seem to be an adequate vehicle. We will marry in the wizard world as soon as we possibly can, he whispered, reaching up and stroking her hair, even if it's in the shrieking shack with the ghosts for company. In her mind her fantasy of a church with her mum, sister and Freya evaporated and was replaced by the wind-swept Northumbrian mountains which had been the backdrop to her home for the last 9 months, and she looked up at Remus again with a look of panic on her face. It's just I don't ever want you to leave. You go out and during the day. I worry so much about you. I worry when you go to an order meeting that you'll have agreed to do something stupid. I'm worried that one day you'll be killed for all of this. Hot tears of pent-up concern were suddenly released and she wiped her hands clumsily across her face. Remus pulled her closer and she buried her head into his shoulder. You worry too much. Remus waited a few moments until Cecilia was quite still before tilting her chin so she was looking at him before kissing her tears. I promise you. Listen. He put a finger on her quivering lip. I promise you that whatever happens, I will never leave you again. That's what's bothering you? Cecilia nodded silently as fleeting glimpses into her past. To Christmas and the note flood back in. What else is wrong? Asked Remus astutely, and Cecilia proceeded to tell him an abbreviated and sanitized version of her feelings about her family and her best friend. I just wish that they didn't have to have died. And that Mum and Amy and Freya were closer. They're safe, said Remus, stroking her hand. I pop in when I can. NXT time you do. Can you take them this? Cecilia leaned across to the notebook that Remus had been completing for her and slid a piece of paper from between the folds of the last couple of pages, and she handed him Freya's drawing of Tipex the cat and her kittens that the young girl had drawn for Cecilia and her mother, Cecilia's best friend, had sent to her for her birthday. Remus smiled. "And now for something for you." Retrieving his wand, he pulled a few strands of her reddish copper hair before entwining it in a few strands of his own. Placing them on the worktop, he flicked his wrist in their direction, and Cecilia watched in awe as their hair intertwined before Remus landed it as a small knot in her hand. Then, he enchanted the knot of hair into a pendant which he had crafted from the one that Cecilia was wearing. "It's an old spell, and not very potent," Remus explained softly. "It was one of the original spells, an old magic spell. Our hair is bound, as are we." "It's beautiful." The words escaped her lips as she marveled at the magic that she had witnessed. Old magic. It was probably even older than marriage itself. Looking back at Remus, she traced her hand around his. And, next to potentially the most world-changing potion in the world, Remus's grandmother would definitely be astounded at the use her grandson was putting to her old store cupboard. 88,888,888. The man in the office had waited for 3 agonizing days before he had been contacted by them. He had to call them something, and in the absence of a name, or even a task, them would have to do. They had contacted him by post, using a plain white envelope, heavily postmarked so as to conceal the design on the stamp, and, as the man had stood in the toilet cubicle of the first floor, mid-journey between the office's post room and his desk, he had hastily opened it, taking care to keep hold of the lapel end that he had torn away from the body of the envelope. It was not unheard for such organizations to wait for the trail to go cold, and he had been expecting to be contacted much later in any case, but, as an impatient person by nature, the man had been at best distracted from his job and family over the last few days, so much so that even his wife had noticed. Inside was a second, much smaller envelope, which the man knew better than to open here, and, as he hastily stowed it away in the inside of his jacket pocket before fantasizing about the possible places where he would become immersed into this up to his elbows. It wasn't until his hand began to grow rapidly hot that he refocused on the here and now, staring in shock as the large, now empty envelope spontaneously combusted. A breezy early summer evening wafted the leaves of the plants set within the ornamental hanging baskets that lined the Brighton promenade. After a hasty phone call from his non-registered mobile phone to that of his wife, he informed her he was working late. Patience is what he needed, he reminded himself, as the sea in the English Channel reflected the westerly sunlight on its crests as the waves gradually flowed towards the beach, hastening a rising tide as the small envelope that remained within his jacket pocket burned as hot as a branding iron. 2 hours later, when he could wait no longer, the man pulled open the small envelope, removing the single sheet of paper from its slim confines, and, as he scanned the blank paper in alarm, turning it over and over in his haste, he almost dropped the offending article as there came a rap on the window. He hadn't heard the car approach, he knew. Or maybe he was so engrossed in the confusion that was the blank sheet of paper in an envelope where there should have been instructions, he simply hadn't heard it arrive. He got out, and the man spoke to him, asking him simply to confirm his name. He then took the blank paper from the man's unresisting grip and replaced it with a brown package, sealed with red wax, before jumping back into the car that had arrived before disappearing. It was only when the man had returned to his own car, driven at speed to a deserted children's playground 20 miles away, that his confused mind registered the fact that the car had indeed disappeared, not simply retreated into the distance. He put the thought aside as he switched on the small reading light in his Mercedes, unwrapping the package that he had been given, looking briefly at the book before flicking through it with his thumb. No note, the man realized, staring at the green binding of the cover. Nothing untoward. Opening it up, he discovered that it was a book containing children's stories. Peeling back the front-end papers, he searched in vain for a clue, for anything that would reveal to him what he was supposed to be doing. The man cast it onto the passenger seat of the car, wondering what he should do next. It wasn't until he was nearly home, the yellow street lights of the town in which he lived making the green cover glowing ethereally, that a thought struck him. And when he pulled up onto the drive, noticing the curtains of the upstairs window twitch stiflingly, the man threw the book into his briefcase, vowing to contact his sister who owed him her help. 88,888,888. It was Monday evening at Smeltings School. The boarding school, its year soon to be ending in less than 6 weeks, was languishing in that end-of-term inertia, has barely batted a collective eyelid at the arrival of a new face which had joined them suddenly that day. Not just a face, the young man in question had indeed every characteristic that a member of such esteemed school that was required: arrogance and money in equally lascivious abundance. It was the arrogance, with an equal measure of disgust, that was particularly crystalline at present, for, in a dormitory filled with a dozen beds, this particular pupil had feigned illness and had been ushered off to the stiflingly hot room whose windows he had flung open shortly after being left alone just in time to prevent him from choking on the hideous stench that was the environment in which he found himself. He had been on his guard since the moment he had arrived at the wretched place, fighting his instincts to belittle and lay into each and every stupid mole who had crossed his path. Draco Malfoy knew why he was there, but it didn't soothe the burning anger that raged in his stomach. Throwing himself on the bed which the idiotic mole dormitory warden had informed him in an agonizingly stupid manner was his, he thought about how the Dark Lord had stood before them both, in a forest in the west of England, in his starkly diminished form. He had told them in a laboured and arduous manner that he was existing by a thread, living amongst the lowest of mole society in order to survive. Draco recalled the Dark Lord's form, weak and vulnerable, nothing like the Herculean figure that stood before the faithful on the night of his glorious return, and remembered his father much later bestowing on him the knowledge that all of his followers who were neither imprisoned or killed, each undertaking a task equally if not of more oaths than the one he had promised to carry out. "Of course Father would say that," shouted Draco in the privacy of his own mind. He wasn't the one stuck here. He wasn't expected to interact and live with these hideous people. Surely his father could have done something? Except of course Draco knew he couldn't. The Dark Lord had his own special means of extracting efficient loyalty. Draco himself had been removed from the actual proceedings, but was given to understand that the Dark Lord asked each of them what they could offer him in service in his hour of need. Draco was given to understand that his father had originally declared that he had nothing of worth, about which, under pressure, he had changed his mind. And then, Draco knew, his father had decried the virtues of Snape. Snape, ha! Anyone with half a brain could see that one coming. Perhaps his father could have asked him his opinion about what he should have offered the Dark Lord rather than telling him that he had nothing to offer. Never mind. But it had riled Draco that his father had offered his services to the Dark Lord because of his own inadequacies. What had angered him further was that his father had told his mother that the Dark Lord had ordered his dispatch to the school. And for what? To find out something they should know already but they had overlooked. Now he would have to endure this wretched place. Draco gazed around the dormitory, nodding at the similarities it held to some of the rooms in Hogwarts. At least it was a school, and, from what he had been able to discern from a day here already, some traditions transcended magic, and he could see how he could easily manipulate several aspects of it in the future. But here the moleness of it all made him wanted to scream. Everything reeked of animal idiocy and inability to such an extent that he could have cursed each and every one of them 1,000 times over. A flood of guilt passed through him, and Draco Malfoy closed his eyes. The main reason he was here was because of the debt that he owed his father. The crest began to recede and further waves lapped over his consciousness. He only had himself to blame for his situation, It had been he who had been the cause of sending his father false information, resulting in a brief and disparaging letter written in the third person, and how he hoped Draco would never meet his incompetent son. As the evening drew in and darkness fell, his blonde hair spilled over a flat pillow. Draco Malfoy thought dark thoughts and cursed silently his own shortcomings.